A grizzly bear fought for hours to survive. Look who came to his rescue. The river had always been a source of life for Bruno. The great grizzly had known its waters since he was a cub, had fished along its rocky banks, waded through its shallows, and felt its cool touch in the heat of summer. It was part of him, a thread woven into the fabric of his existence. But today the river was different. It was not calm nor gentle. It did not flow in soft, rolling waves, but roared like a wounded beast, swollen with the unrelenting rain that had fallen for days. Bruno had sensed the change before he saw it, smelled it in the air, earth and water mixing in a way that spoke of destruction. He had climbed to higher ground, seeking refuge in the dense pines, but the hunger in his belly had drawn him back down. Fish would be plentiful in the shallows, struggling against the unnatural current, easy prey for a bear as strong as he. But as he neared the banks, the land beneath him trembled. The river had grown monstrous, swallowing the trees at its edges, claiming the stones that once broke its surface. And then, without warning, the earth beneath his paws gave way. The bank crumbled in an instant, and Bruno's world turned to chaos. He plunged into the raging water, the cold biting through his thick fur, stealing his breath. Instinct took over, paws churning, muscles straining, his body twisting against the current's merciless pull. He was powerful, built for battle, but this was a fight against something far greater than himself. The river had no conscience, no weakness to exploit. It dragged him under, spun him like driftwood, filled his nostrils with water, threatening to drown him in its furious embrace. He surfaced with a desperate gasp, his massive body colliding with a floating tree trunk. Claws scraped against slick bark, finding purchase for only a moment before the current wrenched him free. Panic threatened to overtake him, but Bruno pushed it down. He had survived harsh winters, bitter starvation, and battles with other bears. He would survive this. Upstream, a figure stood beneath the cover of a weathered porch, watching. Jack Reynolds had been awake for hours, the storm keeping sleep at bay. Rain drummed against the metal roof of his cabin, the wind howling through the trees like a restless spirit. He had seen floods before, had waded through knee-high water in cities swallowed by hurricanes, had carried screaming children from rooftops, had pulled bodies from the wreckage of homes. It had been a different life then, a life of purpose, of action. Now he was just a man in a cabin on the edge of nowhere, watching the world drown from a distance. He took a slow sip of coffee, dark and bitter, feeling the heat curl against the chill in his chest. His gaze followed the river's violent path, noting the broken trees and floating debris, the earth giving way in places where it had once been solid. And then something moved, a shape among the waves, fighting, struggling. He squinted against the rain, his mind piecing together what he was seeing. An animal, large, too large for a deer, too powerful in its thrashing to be anything else. A bear. Jack exhaled sharply, setting his mug down with a hollow clank against the railing. He should walk away. It wasn't his fight. Nature had its own rules, and the river had claimed far greater things than a single bear. But even as he thought it, his feet were already moving. His military boots sank into the mud as he hurried down toward the bank, his pulse quickening in a way it hadn't in years. It was stupid, reckless, but the sight of the struggling animal, the sheer will to live evident in its every movement, stirred something deep inside him, something he had long buried. He reached his old fishing boat, a small aluminum thing he hadn't used in months, its oars strapped to the sides. The river was faster than anything he could row against, but if he angled it right, caught the current instead of fighting it, maybe, just maybe, he could get close. Bruno was losing strength. The water was relentless, dragging him further from the familiar, deeper into its cold abyss. His lungs burned, muscles screamed. He fought to reach a piece of floating debris, something to cling to, but the river had other plans. A jagged branch caught against his side, raking through fur and flesh, and a deep, guttural roar escaped him. Pain was a distant thing, secondary to survival, but his body was betraying him. The river had no mercy, it would not stop. His head dipped beneath the surface once more, and for a moment all was quiet. No howling wind, no roaring water. Just silence, cold and endless. A strange sort of peace. And then something caught him. Something solid, rough, cutting against his sodden fur. A rope. It wrapped around his chest, tightened, jerked him upward. He broke through the surface with a gasp, blinking against the sting of rain and water. A shape loomed close, moving with the current. A boat, and in it, a man. Jack braced his boots against the bottom of the boat, his muscles straining as he held firm to the rope. The bear was massive, impossibly heavy, the weight of a beast and the river itself pulling against him. Jack's arms burned, his grip slipping, but he gritted his teeth and pulled harder. "Come on," he growled under his breath. The bear fought, twisting, roaring in either terror or rage. Jack didn't know which, didn't care. He just knew he couldn't let go. Bruno lashed out, claws catching the side of the boat, rocking it dangerously. Jack swore, shifting his weight to keep from tipping over. His heart pounded. He could let go, let the river take the bear, save himself the risk. But he held on. The bear's eyes locked onto his for a brief second. Dark, wild, filled with the same desperation Jack had seen in too many eyes before. The kind that belonged to those who knew they were close to death. Jack gave one last heave, the force of it nearly pulling him from the boat, and the bear lurched forward, half onto the side, half still in the water. The current fought them both, tried to rip them apart, but Jack had already decided he wasn't letting go. The bear, whether it understood or simply had no choice, stopped struggling. For the first time, it allowed the help. And together, man and beast drifted toward shore, carried by the storm, bound by the will to survive. Jack's breath came in ragged bursts as he fought against the weight of the bear, the river, and the raw exhaustion clawing at his limbs. The boat groaned under the strain, water sloshing violently over its edges as the current threatened to pull them both under. His hands burned against the rough rope, his knuckles white from gripping it too tightly, but he didn't dare loosen his hold. The bear, Bruno, though Jack didn't know his name, remained half submerged, his massive chest rising and falling in shuddering gasps, his dark eyes flickering between panic and surrender. Jack knew that look. He had seen it too many times before, on the faces of men pulled from burning wreckage, on the lost souls who clung to life by sheer instinct alone. It was the look of something on the edge of giving up, but not quite ready to die. Jack's legs braced against the boat's metal frame, muscles screaming with effort as he hauled on the rope again, inching the bear closer to safety. The river fought back, yanking at Bruno's hulking form with an almost sentient rage, as if determined to claim him. Jack gritted his teeth, shifting his stance, angling the boat toward the far bank where the water ran shallower. He needed land, solid ground where the bear could pull himself free, where Jack wouldn't have to fight both the storm and the instincts of a terrified predator. But they weren't there yet. A sudden wave crashed over them, nearly knocking Jack off his feet, sending the boat lurching sideways. The rope burned against his palms as it slipped, and for one terrifying moment, he thought he'd lost him. But then, Bruno's massive paw struck out, claws hooking onto the edge of the boat, his body heaving forward. Jack felt the shift immediately, the weight of the bear changing from dead resistance to something else. Willpower, a decision to fight. Jack didn't hesitate. He seized the moment, planting his boots deeper, using every ounce of strength left in his battered body to keep them from capsizing. "Come on, big guy," he muttered through clenched teeth, not caring that the bear couldn't understand. "You want to live, you gotta help me here." As if responding, Bruno let out a deep, guttural growl, not one of anger, but something raw, something close to determination. His muscles flexed beneath waterlogged fur, his claws scraping against the boat as he shifted his weight forward. Jack took the risk, reaching with one hand to steady the bear's massive shoulder, his fingers sinking into the coarse, matted fur. It was thick with water, slick with river debris, but beneath it he could feel the raw power of the beast, coiled, waiting, ready to push through. He had no idea if the bear would turn on him the moment they hit land, if those claws would tear into him in fear or instinct, but it didn't matter. He wasn't letting go. The river refused to make it easy. Another current slammed into them, shoving the boat sideways, spinning it toward a cluster of broken trees jutting from the water like skeletal hands. Jack cursed under his breath, throwing his weight forward to keep them from tipping. Bruno let out another low rumble, a deep vibration that Jack could feel in his bones. It wasn't a threat, it was something else. Maybe frustration, maybe exhaustion, maybe understanding. With a final desperate heave, Jack guided the boat toward the shallows, where the raging current lost some of its power, where the land was close enough that survival didn't feel like an impossible dream. His boots scraped against submerged rocks, his body tilting as he half fell, half lunged toward the bank. The rope tightened around his wrist as Bruno's weight shifted again, and then suddenly the bear was moving, surging forward with the last of his strength, using Jack's pull, using whatever force he had left to drag himself up and out of the water. They collapsed together onto the muddy shore, both man and beast too spent to move, their chests heaving in tandem, steam rising from their soaked bodies in the cold night air. Jack lay on his back, staring up at the storm-darkened sky, feeling every inch of his body throbbing with exhaustion. His breath came in sharp gasps, his arms like dead weight at his sides. He could hear the river still raging behind them, the sound of its hunger, its endless thirst for destruction. But they had beaten it, for now at least. He turned his head slightly, eyes shifting toward the bear beside him. Bruno lay sprawled on the mud, his fur matted with water and debris, his massive frame quivering with exertion. His dark eyes were open but unfocused, his chest rising and falling in the slow, heavy breaths. Jack exhaled, a slow chuckle slipping past his lips despite himself. "Hell of a night, huh?" The bear didn't react, not really, but his ears flicked slightly at the sound of Jack's voice, a small acknowledgement that he was still there, still alive. Jack let his head fall back against the ground, closing his eyes for just a moment. He didn't know how long they lay there like that. Minutes, maybe hours. The storm still raged around them, but the worst of it had passed, leaving only the sound of wind whipping through the trees, the distant roar of the river that had nearly taken them both. He knew he needed to move, needed to check for injuries, needed to find shelter before the cold did what the river couldn't. But right now his body refused to listen. He had nothing left to give. Neither, it seemed, did the bear. Eventually, Bruno stirred, his massive body shifting slightly in the mud, a deep, slow breath rattling through him. Jack tensed instinctively, his muscles locking as he prepared for the possibility that the bear would suddenly remember he was a human, that fear or instinct would take over. But the attack never came. Instead, Bruno simply let out a long, shuddering breath and rested his head on his massive paws. Jack watched him for a moment, something unreadable passing through his expression. He had spent years pulling people from danger, from fires, from disasters, from death itself. But this was something different. He had saved men before, but never a bear. Jack exhaled again, forcing himself to sit up, every muscle in his body protesting. His clothes were soaked through, his hands raw and shaking. The fire in his chest had dulled, but the exhaustion remained, thick and suffocating. He ran a hand through his dripping hair, his gaze drifting back to Bruno. "Well, big guy," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Guess we're stuck with each other for a little while." Bruno didn't move, but Jack swore he saw something flicker in those dark eyes, something beyond simple animal instinct. It was brief, a ghost of recognition, but it was there. Jack sighed, glancing around, taking in their surroundings with a soldier's practiced eye. The woods stretched out behind them, thick and unyielding. His cabin wasn't far, maybe half a mile if he was guessing right. He had supplies there, dry clothes, fire, shelter. He could make it. The question was, what about the bear? Jack flexed his fingers, feeling the dull ache in his joints, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. One thing at a time. First, get up. Second, get moving. And third, well, he'd figure that out when he got there. He turned to Bruno one last time before pushing himself to his feet. "Come on," he muttered. "Let's go home." Jack forced his aching body to move, every joint screaming in protest as he pushed himself to his feet. The mud sucked at his boots, the weight of his drenched clothes pulling him down, but he ignored it. The storm had eased, the worst of the wind and rain passing, but the air remained bitter, and the cold gnawed at his skin. He wiped the water from his face with a trembling hand and turned to look at the bear. Bruno hadn't moved much. His massive form still sprawled across the soaked earth, his chest rising and falling in deep, uneven breaths. Steam rose from his wet fur, curling into the night air like the ghost of the river still clinging to him. Jack took a slow step forward, cautious but not afraid. He had no idea what the bear would do now that the immediate danger had passed. Would he lash out, run, collapse entirely? Jack wasn't sure, and there was only one way to find out. Bruno's dark eyes flickered open as Jack approached, his ears twitching at the sound of boots squelching in the mud. The bear's breathing remained labored, but there was something in his gaze, an awareness that hadn't been there before, as if, for the first time, he was truly seeing Jack and not just another threat in the chaos of survival. Jack held up his hands, palms facing out, not because he thought it would make a difference, but because it felt like the right thing to do. "Easy, big guy," he murmured, voice low and steady. "We're not enemies, not tonight." Bruno blinked sluggishly, his body shifting just enough to let Jack know he wasn't completely broken. Jack exhaled, nodding to himself. "That's right. You're still breathing. That means we keep going." He turned toward the tree line, scanning the familiar terrain with a practiced eye. His cabin wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute walk under normal conditions, but nothing about tonight had been normal. He needed fire, warmth, dry clothes, and food, though he doubted the bear would be up for eating anything right now. Hell, he wasn't sure if Bruno would even follow. Would he trust Jack enough to move with him? Jack hesitated, then took a few steps away, testing the waters. The bear didn't react immediately, but his ears perked slightly, his head lifting just enough to watch Jack go. Good. He was still alert. Jack paused, turning back. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the trees. "Unless you want to spend the night freezing your ass off out here." Bruno didn't move. Jack sighed, running a hand through his soaked hair. "Figures. You weigh a damn ton, and you're too stubborn to get up." For a long moment, they just stared at each other, man and beast, both caught in the strange limbo of exhaustion and reluctant trust. Jack had seen this before, not with bears, but with people, with soldiers who had been through hell, with civilians he'd pulled from burning buildings, with kids who had been too scared to run until someone told them it was okay. He took a slow step back toward Bruno, crouching down slightly to his level. "I know you're spent," he said, his voice softer now, less of a command and more of an understanding. "I know it hurts, but we can't stay here. You want to live? Then you got to get up." Bruno's ears twitched. His breath hitched slightly, his body shifting, muscles trembling from fatigue. Jack didn't move, didn't press. He just waited. The bear let out a low, deep grunt, something between frustration and effort, and then, finally, he pushed himself onto his paws. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't easy. His legs wobbled, his massive shoulders sagging under the weight of his own body. But he stood. Jack grinned, pushing to his own feet. "That's more like it." The first steps were slow, painful. Jack kept a steady pace, glancing back every few moments to make sure the bear was still with him. Bruno lumbered behind, his movements sluggish but determined, his breath coming in heavy puffs of steam against the cold. They walked in silence, the forest around them eerily still, as if the storm had stolen all the sound from the world. Jack focused on the path ahead, his mind flicking through everything he needed to do once they reached the cabin. First, fire. Second, dry clothes. Third, check for injuries, on both of them. His body was one massive ache, his hands raw from gripping the rope, his ribs sore from the struggle. The bear was worse off, no doubt. He needed rest, warmth, maybe even medical attention, though Jack had no idea how the hell he was supposed to help a wounded grizzly. One problem at a time. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the cabin finally came into view. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was a small, sturdy thing, built for function over comfort, its wooden frame nestled between towering pines. Smoke still curled faintly from the chimney. He had left the fire going before the storm had pulled him outside, and for once his carelessness was a blessing. He reached the front door, shoving it open with a heavy hand, then stepped aside, glancing back at Bruno. "You coming?" The bear hesitated at the threshold, his massive frame silhouetted against the night. His breath was heavy, his body sagging, but he didn't run. He didn't turn away. Jack took a slow step back, giving him space. "I get it. Not exactly your usual den, huh?" Bruno huffed a deep, tired sound, then took one slow step forward, then another, and then, with the kind of deliberate exhaustion that only came after a fight for survival, he stepped inside. Jack shut the door behind them, locking out the cold, the storm, the river, everything that had tried to kill them tonight. The warmth from the fire was immediate, wrapping around him like a second skin, sinking into his bones. He shrugged off his jacket, wincing as the movement pulled at sore muscles, then grabbed the extra blankets from the chair near the hearth. He hesitated for only a second before tossing one toward the bear. "Doubt you want it, but it's there," he muttered, then moved to stoke the fire. He worked in silence, the only sounds in the cabin, the crackling of flames and the deep, slow breaths of the bear behind him. When he finally turned, Bruno had collapsed near the door, his massive body curled just slightly, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Jack watched him for a long moment, then exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well," he muttered, mostly to himself, "this is the dumbest thing I've ever done." Bruno didn't move, didn't react. He was already slipping into sleep, his body too battered and exhausted to care about the strangeness of their situation. Jack sat down heavily on the chair near the fire, letting his head tip back against the worn wood. He stared at the ceiling, at the flickering shadows cast by the firelight, and felt something strange settle in his chest. He had spent years trying to outrun the past, trying to bury the parts of himself that had once cared too much. But tonight, against all logic, against all reason, he had fought to save something wild, something untamed, something that should have never trusted him. And yet, here they were, alive. Jack closed his eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the bear, and let sleep take him too.